Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this virtual lecture, The Origins of World War I. You don't actually have to submit anything tonight online for this lecture, but remember the next time I see you, on the 29th of March, you will have to submit a short essay on Chapter 5 of Nye's text. That will be for marks, and you submit it online through the Turnitin link like usual. Tonight's lecture is quite important as a possible exam question. I do like to ask questions surrounding the origins of World War I, because World War I really set the agenda for the 20th century and helped to create World War II and even the Cold War that followed thereafter. It's quite an important conflict historically, which is why we cover it in International Conflict. But before we begin with the actual content of the lecture, let's see if we can watch this video. So that was a video that was looking at the SS Mendi, and you all were aware of the anniversary on the 21st of February that was celebrated in our country. Well, really, the lives of the people lost were celebrated in a commemoration, because 607 troops serving in the South African Native Labour contingent died when the steamship SS Mendi sank in the English Channel on the way to France. So South African soldiers did participate in World War I. This is a quick sketch on the origins of World War I. You can also see it on Ulink under the virtual lecture link.
Permission to ask a question, sir?
Permission granted, Warwick, as long as it isn't the one about where babies come from.
No. The thing is, the way I see it, these days there's a war on, right? And ages ago there wasn't a war on, right? So there must have been a moment when there not being a war on went away, right? And there being a war on came along. So what I want to know is, how did we get from the one case of affairs to the other case of affairs?
Do you mean, how did the war start?
Yeah.
The war started because of the vile Hun and his villainous Empire Bill.
George, the British Empire at present covers a quarter of the globe, while the German Empire consists of a small sausage factory in Tanganyika. I hardly think that we can be entirely absolved from blame on the imperialistic front.
No, sir, absolutely not. Man's a blight.
I heard that it started when a bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry.
I think you mean it started when the Archduke of Austro-Hungary got shot.
No, there was definitely an ostrich involved.
Well, possibly. But the real reason for the whole thing was that it was just too much effort not to have a war.
By gum, this is interesting. I always loved history. Oh, Battle of Hastings, Henry VIII and his 6 knives, all that.
You see, Baldrick, in order to prevent war in Europe, 2 superblocks developed. Us, the French and the Russians on one side, and the Germans and Austro-Hungary on the other. The idea was to have 2 vast opposing armies, each acting as the other's deterrent. That way, there could never be a war.
But this is a sort of a war, isn't it, sir?
Yes, that's right. You see, there was a tiny flaw in the plan.
What was that, sir?
It was bullets.
So the poor old ostrich died for nothing.
Okay, so you can have a look at that on Ulink here if you want to have a watch again of that BBC clip. And now we'll get back to the actual lecture itself. So there's just another picture of the actual memorial in South Africa and the SS Mendi itself, with a link up at the top here if you want to find out more about it. The important thing about this lecture is that I could ask you an exam question where I say something like, using various concepts gathered over the semester in this module, explain a conflict in the 20th or 21st century. So I might expect you to use phrases like alliance systems, or political leadership, or military doctrine, or power. And what is your understanding of power? It's one of the questions on page 4 in your study guide. Just to refresh your memories, power is the ability to achieve your purpose or goal by influencing others and getting them to do whatever you'd like them to do in order to ensure the outcomes you want happen. Power conversion is the capacity for a state to convert potential power resources to realized power. And this is measured by the changed behavior of others. So, importantly, in our case, if you want to try and predict outcomes correctly, you need to know about a country's skill at power conversion. How are they able to achieve their ultimate goal by changing the behavior of others through the conversion of their potential power resources to actual implemented realized power? Power resources at the end of the day depend on the context. For example, having 5 million tanks to try and defeat an army won't help you if it's a swampish area and the tanks can't travel across the water. We also have to consider facts around, is it hard power or soft power? Hard power, if you remember from your undergrad days, is all about the use of positive or negative sanctions to try and persuade people's behavior through carrot or sticks. You can also get soft power, which is all about the idea of trying to convince people to do what you'd like them to do through a kind of persuasion and attraction of sorts. Balance of power is an important term when it comes to this lecture as well, because balance of power could feature in the exam if I ask you to explain how balance of power may or may not have led to conflict or armed conflict. The point behind balance of power is that states are supposed to balance power between them, whether it's in 2 blocks or 3 blocks or bilaterally in terms of 2 states, in order to not preserve peace necessarily, but to preserve their independence. And the result is that balance of power, at the end of the day, through that is supposed to produce a kind of stability. But we know that it does not preserve peace. What it does preserve is the anarchic state system, because all it does is allow for 2 centers of power or 3 centers of power to exist in the world. But all that does at the end of the day is create uneasiness or dis-ease between these 2 powers as they try to weigh up against each other in terms of stability. So we look at the hegemonic stability theory instead, which is all about having to produce peace in society. It's better to have unequal power, politics, conflict, literature says, because then other states will be too scared to attack the main state, because it is the hegemon in the region. So you can decide for yourselves if you think that's a valid argument or not. But instead of assuming that balance of power will preserve peace, we know historically it does not do so. Hegemonic stability theory says that because people feel threatened by the strength of one state in a region, they won't likely attack it. What happens, of course, if all the weaker states join together and ally with each other, or create an alliance to try and balance against the greater hegemon? Then we revert to balance of power above, and we know that that does not preserve peace. Balance of power is supposed to be about the distribution of power resources in society. After all, we can suggest that changes in the unequal distribution of power may be a factor, maybe not the sole factor, but it could be a factor in explaining war. Balance of power as policy, a state might very easily choose to bandwagon. Balance of power, after all, does say that if you join the weaker side to try and balance power across the globe, there should be peace. And then you can get balance of power as multipolar systems. This you can see in terms of structure and process, in practical terms, for the origins of World War I. So if countries might choose to ally with others or create alliances, what are these? Basically, formal or informal arrangements that sovereign states enter into with each other in order to ensure their mutual security. So military alliances were very, very common throughout the 20th century, but now economic alliances are more common since more states have taken on the mantle of democratic leadership, and as we know from last week's lecture, democracies don't tend to go to war with one another. So we can take examples of alliances from World War I because we have on the right side here the Triple Entente, which was the name given to the alliance of Great Britain, France and Russia, and we have the Triple Alliance, which was the name given to Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy, also known as the Central Powers, in the build-up and during World War I. Just so you know, World War I had many, many different causes, even though we know that the assassination of the Archduke was the precipitating cause of the war, the actual lit match that created the conflict, or let it begin or commence the conflict. In fact, there were many, many causes of World War I, including nationalism, imperialism, alliances, the collapse of Bismarck's alliances. When Bismarck was gone, basically, the systems grew very tense in Europe. The arms race, a kind of self-reinforcing cycle of heightened military preparedness in Europe. Different crises in Africa, the Bosnian crisis of 1908, the Morocco, the second crisis. So the first one was in 1905 to 1906, and then again in 1911. Then, of course, the assassination in Sarajevo of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and all of this led to falling dominoes in Europe. So it is impossible to isolate one single cause of World War I, and there's a very specific phrase we use for this. It's called, the war was overdetermined. Overdetermined. In other words, there were too many different causes of the war. But we look at it and break it down into three simple levels: systems level, state level, and individual level. If you have a look here at this picture of Kaiser Wilhelm II, in 1859 you can see here by this writing, he was born delivered by forceps, and as a result his left arm was twisted very badly. His tutors tried to remedy this in a very harsh way by forcing him to wear a corset and packing his arm in surgical braces and splints. If you have a look at this picture, titled A Real-Life Photograph Made in February 1861, the arm is apparently in good shape, but Wilhelm's mother tried to keep everything a secret, to conceal the defect by keeping her own son from public view. His private teacher was even worse. So Kaiser Wilhelm basically wrote about him being this stiff pedant who was essentially cheerless, and so was his manner of teaching. So basically that's just a picture of this man who was leading Germany at the time of World War I, and he had a very unstable background. But if you would like to know more about the origins of World War I, you can read the chapter. There are many different sites to look at, but there will be a second lecture coming up now, attached to this one, which explains a little bit more in depth about these three different levels.